Good afternoon and welcome to today's lecture on space and U.S. national security, what to expect in 2022 and beyond. We are thrilled to have John Gaylor, Assistant Vice President for National Security Space at the Aerospace Industries Association, joining us for today's discussion. My name is Paul Griebel. I'm the Vice President of the World Affairs Council of Miami, a nonpartisan, nonprofit organization that aims to engage the people of South Florida on global issues. And I have the privilege of welcoming you all today and helping to moderate this session. And right now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Eric Hoffman, Dean of Miami-Dade College's Honors College, the presenting partner for today's lecture. Please join me in welcoming Dean Hoffman. Dean?
Thank you, Paul. On behalf of Miami-Dade College Wolfson campus and the Honors College, I'm delighted to welcome the Honors College students and everyone in attendance to our third event in our Distinguished Speaker Series. Tonight's event is brought to you in partnership with the World Affairs Council of Miami. This evening's timely and important discussion, titled Space and U.S. National Security, What to Expect in 2022 and Beyond, is by notable expert John Gaylor. I'm grateful for the World Affairs Council of America's dedication to informative and stimulating program like tonight's discussion, which aligns closely with the Honors College mission, providing highly accessible, high-quality educational programming to our students from across Miami-Dade community. I look forward to more opportunities to help host events such as the Distinguished Speaker Series as our partnership with the Miami chapter of the World Affairs Council of America continues to grow. As honor students, please engage and ask questions when given the opportunity. Now let me hand it back to Paul with the introduction of tonight's speaker.
Thank you very much, Dean Hoffman, for your support and that of the Honors College in delivering these important and timely discussions to our academic and international community. As a reminder to everyone attending today's lecture, please feel free to enter your questions and comments in the chat and Q&A function, as we will address your thoughts following John Gaylor's remarks. It's now my pleasure to introduce John Gaylor, again, the Assistant Vice President for National Security Space at the Aerospace Industries Association. John is a former active duty Air Force Space Operations Officer, experienced in leading dynamic teams in space operations, strategy, communications, and policy. Over the course of his career, he served as a trusted advisor and strategic communicator for chief executives in the Department of Defense, the intelligence community, and U.S. Congress. And he holds a BS in journalism from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign and an MBA from Florida State University. So we look forward to John's presentation and his comments, and again remind you to enter your comments and thoughts and questions as they come up during the course of his conversation. And I now turn it over to you, John.
Thanks, Paul, and thanks to the World Affairs Council for having me, and Dean Hoffman for being here. Certainly a topic I'm passionate about. I've spent my entire career in it. And I think really we're at a nexus right now where the national security space community is really coming into its own. If you can't turn on the news or hop on Twitter without seeing results from space that are clearly showing what's happening in the Ukraine and in Russia right now. And I think that is just a small bit of what space plays for the national security apparatus of this nation and the global commons of the world. So I want to take some time here today, walk you through a couple of slides. I know Lanier is going to have them teed up for me here in just a second, and just kind of give you an idea of what we talk about when we mean national security space, what encompasses that full apparatus, why we have some of these organizations, what their missions and roles are. And then I really want to talk and set the table for the discussion on some challenges. Feel free to ask any questions you have. Nothing is off limits here. Really, this is something I'm incredibly passionate about, and I think has, a lot of potential to really be game changing, not just for, for the military, the intelligence community, but for all those instruments of national power that the nation has. So go to the next slide, if you would, Lanier. So I do always like to start with, how did we get here? So space is really new, really. We have not, the first satellite was launched in the 1950s, and here we are in 2022 with our own service. So we got here from a guy named Bernard Schriever. You've heard of Schriever Air Force Base. It's now called Schriever Space Force Base, potentially out in Colorado. But he was the father of the intercontinental ballistic missile. So as the Cold War was ramping up and we were looking for ways to deliver nuclear payloads to targets, obviously not anywhere near the United States, he was the general in charge with creating the nuclear delivery systems, these ICBMs. And ultimately, the ICBM technology is what advanced the space pursuits for the country. So those are really the beginnings of the Space Force. Think through the Cold War era, right? We lost Francis Gary Powers. There was a U-2 pilot shot down towards the very end of the Eisenhower administration. Massive, massive international fallout from what happened there. But we had a different way to gain some of that similar imagery through a classified space program that was going on at the time. And it was really only about 100 to 150 days after that shoot down that we actually brought back the first film capsule from space. You can see the picture there right next to General Schriever, strategic imagery. So we could understand, where did Russia have nuclear weapons? What were they doing with strategic weapons? So there was always this strategic focus to space, and that was really what it was used for. We never thought about it on the tactical battlefield. That all changed in the early 90s with Operation Desert Storm. And we started to see, hey, we're now operating in an environment where there's not a whole lot of waypoints. You're looking at a lot of desert. We've got GPS, so we can tell folks exactly where they're at. We've got weather satellites. We can see when there might be sandstorms or bad weather coming in. So we know where to, where the tanks should go. So we know where clear landing zones are so that we can go ahead and rescue injured troops. So we really shifted from strategic to tactical around the late 80s, early 90s timeframe. And as the military community started to see that use, the demand just went and skyrocketed. 10 years later, after 9/11, we saw use cases from there for the past 20 years. And we've just continued to integrate space across the battlefield while also keeping up those strategic and important missions that they're doing. Ultimately, this has become quite a subject of discussion. And in late 2019, we ended up with Space Force as a service. And that's why I want to focus a few of our discussion points on here today. And go to the next slide. Space Force only makes up a portion of what I call national security space. So these are two sides of the coin. There's the Title 10. So Title 10 in US code, which is your Department of Defense. And so you've got a combatant command, United States Space Command, as well as United States Space Force. And you've also got Title 50, and that's your intelligence community. So this Title 50 designation came in the 80s when President Reagan had an executive order on intelligence. And then around the 2004 timeframe, again, right after 9/11, a couple of years, we had an Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. And so that created the Office of the Director of National Intelligence, the ODNI, and that formed 17 organizations underneath that umbrella. And I say 17 because actually the 17th member just came on board in 2020. And on the very far right there of that slide, you can see that's the Space Force. So all the military services are a part of this, but there's also some of these intelligence community apparatuses. And the three that really fall under this national security space umbrella are the National Security Agency, the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, and the National Reconnaissance Office. So the NSA, the NGA, and the NRO. The NRO, there in the middle, they're the folks that are building the overhead collection platforms that those two, the NGA and the NSA, use to do their intelligence missions. So there is more than just Space Force. There's more than just Space Command. And there is this entire other piece called the intelligence community that plays significantly in the national security space world. It's important to bring those up. They are separate funding lines. They are certainly separate congressional authorizations. So as we look at some of the challenges that we're going to start to see here unfold, that's definitely part of it, is that you have two separate organizations and who's in charge of each and what do those command chains look like. Going to the next slide. So that's the National Security Space Organizations. Just want to make sure everybody is familiar with the missions as well. So I think some are a lot more visible and a lot more apparent than others. PNT, Position, Navigation, and Timing. You would probably most commonly refer to it as GPS, but GPS, this is kind of like the Kleenex or Band-Aid analogy. GPS is just a kind of position, navigation, and timing, but it's also the kind that the majority of the world uses. There are others out there. The Russians have one called GLONASS. The Chinese are building one called Beidou. The European Union has one called Galileo, but these are all systems from space that can actually provide you with an exact point on the globe where you're at, and also some really, really precise timing. So this is really good for putting bombs on target. This is really good for letting troops know where they're at in the heart of conflict, but it's also just as good as making sure your Uber Eats delivery gets there, or making sure when you go to Miami Airport that you're taking the best route through traffic via your Waze app. If you've got a Garmin watch or an iPhone, you are using GPS whether you know it or not. At one point in 2014, the Russians actually had an outage of their own system, this GLONASS, And they defaulted to using GPS when that went out. So it's got massive, massive implications for the broader national security apparatus. But then there's this, we call it a dual use. All the civilians of the world are getting this, and it's free too. There's no charge for that. So this is something that's really important when you think about conflict and you think about how folks are going to navigate around. What are those dynamics like? Some other pieces, environmental monitoring. Space, really, a lot of our start came out of the weather business. We launched camera satellites, so no kidding, had film on board satellites that would take images of Russia or wherever we wanted to image, and they would literally drop the canister through the atmosphere and it would be collected by an aircraft. Incredibly sophisticated technologies for the 1960s. But when you only have so many shots of film, you can't waste it. So we actually built weather satellites, not to tell us the weather that was going on, whether you needed to know to wear a raincoat, but actually to understand if there was going to be cloud cover over the targets that we were going to take pictures of with these sensitive spy satellites that only had so much capability to take because of the film limitations. Communications. So now your cell phone is not operating off of a satellite, but there are plenty of satellite communications phones that are out there, and you're going to see that much more prevalent, right? You're starting to see SpaceX with Starlink. I really hope we spend some time talking about what's going on in the Ukraine right now, but that is one that's getting a lot of energy in the news right now, that you can get some communications for broadband internet as well. But think of it from the military perspective, right? When we came up with this is about making sure our troops, all of our fighting vehicles, planes, ships, everything of that nature have means to communicate. And this goes all the way to the end of the nuclear spectrum, right? To have a communications platform that can speak through nuclear fallout, through nuclear scintillation, can pulse atmospheric messages to be able to communicate with higher headquarters, right? So there's this strategic view of that too. Down at the bottom right there, missile warning. So we've got radars all over the country, and actually we've got some outside of the country as well, that have been around since the 60s, right? This was all the Cold War, but keeping an eye on intercontinental ballistic missiles. Where were they entering the atmosphere so that we could start to predict where would those potential impacts be and help those decision makers understand. We also do missile warning from satellites as well, so that we've got dual phenomenology and we can really kind of piece that puzzle together very quickly and understand when the US would potentially be under threat. Now, those radars on the ground can actually see into space as well and track satellites and see what's going on. And what we're starting to see with conflicts and things of that nature and some hostile intent, really track what's going on there. I've already talked about intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance, right? But this is something that certainly I want you to think about. What the intelligence community does is called National Technical Means, NTM. But there's a burgeoning commercial base that sells imagery that can do it very cheap. And it's not meant to compete with that national imagery, but it's actually meant to augment it. So this right here is actually not a national shot, which I wouldn't be able to show you on here, but that is actually a commercial image. So when you pull up Google Earth, or when you see what's going on the news coverage tonight, and you're seeing tanks rolling through Ukraine, or you're seeing aircraft being counted on a runway, that's largely commercial imagery. And that's starting to play into the picture of the national security space enterprise from a actual industrial perspective, where there is a different business use case for this. A couple others on the next slide. So space lift, this is clearly the most visible piece of space. I'm not sure if down in Miami you can see when they launch out of Cape Canaveral. I hope so, because launches are some of the most fun part of the business. And if you haven't got to see one, I would certainly encourage. They're doing one darn near every week up there at the Cape. And the feel of it from being close is incredible. So this is a mission for us, right? You have to build these satellites. It could take years and sometimes decades to put together, very expensive satellites. You got to get them up to space somehow. So we predominantly do that right now from Cape Canaveral in Florida, but then also from Vandenberg Space Force Base on the central coast of California. You're going to start to see some smaller launch companies come up. Satellites, this is a trend right now, are getting smaller. When they're smaller, they weigh a lot less. They're a lot easier to get to orbit, and you can do that on smaller rockets. So you're going to start to see smaller rocket companies come. You're going to see folks that can drop a rocket off of a 747 aircraft. So you can pretty much do that from anywhere in the world. So start to think about, if we would actually see a space shooting match, an actual conflict in space, how you could repurpose a constellation very quickly when you don't have to use really big, heavy, expensive rockets like you see there on the left. Space electronic warfare, we won't spend a lot of time thinking about or talking about that, but just think about this from an offensive and a defensive perspective of jamming, right? And then of also locating sources of interference. And then finally, space domain awareness. So this is SDA. There's also an organization called the Space Development Agency called SDA. But this is essentially understanding what is on orbit and not just tracking it. That is space situational awareness. This is understanding if there's actual intent of it. We started seeing things where we would see what we were tracking as debris, and all of a sudden it would start moving. We saw this example from the Russians. And ultimately that came to find out like, oh, that's actually not just a piece of space junk. That is a adversarial weapon in space. And so this is something that we have to do, track all of this debris and understand the intent, right? It is really putting that military intelligence capability behind just tracking. It's very important to say, hey, to a satellite provider in the country, you have a satellite that's getting close to something else, be careful, so we don't want them to collide. But understanding, the real hostile risk that this stuff plays, as well as, what intent is from adversaries, is really important. So they've really focused the military side, the Space Force side, on understanding space domain awareness, so that they know their battle space that the Space Force is operating in. Let's go to the next slide real quick. And I do really just want to talk about why a Space Force. And you saw the picture in the beginning, and I think one of the biggest myths out there was that, Space Force was just a pet rock of a president. That is not the case. In fact, I actually have on my desk right here, right now, a report from 2001. This was the Rumsfeld Commission that actually looked at space, and it kind of got derailed a little bit because of 9/11, took the eye off of that ball. But there was a proposal on that 21 years ago saying, hey, you should probably think about a separate space service. There was a bipartisan group of representatives from the House of Representatives that actually created some language for a Space Corps before we ended up where we're at. That said, it takes both sides to make this happen. So the executive branch, the legislative branch got together and created a Space Force. But why do we need that? I think this is something I really like to hammer home because I am a believer in the Space Force, and I do think it's very important that we have this separate service. Ultimately, America is truly dependent on space for our economic prosperity, for our national security, and for our everyday way of life. Almost every sector of the economy relies on some sort of data from space. So whether it's that weather data we talked about, communications, imagery, these are things we use in our personal and our professional life. GPS doesn't just get you across town or make sure that your groceries come through your Instacart order, but it also enables timestamps for credit and debit card purchases. It ensures that $5 trillion a day of market transactions go through because of this timing capability that it has. But so as we, the initial intent when we developed space was national security, and that is really more important than ever before. That provides real-time communications to commanders around the globe, eyes and ears to really quickly alert decision makers of emerging threats. It puts weapons on target with pinpoint accuracy, and it can warn of inbound weapons as well. And that's something that I think, if you haven't heard this story, back when the Iranians launched against U.S. forces in theater, it was actually space satellites that had the early warning of that and were able to provide notice to U.S. troops to take cover. And so you've seen the fallout from that. We had many service members with concussions, but ultimately we didn't lose any lives that day, largely because space was able to help give them the ultimate early warning. So there's a massive dependence on space. On the next slide, the other reason that space is so important that we had to have a service is that space is very unique. It is an asymmetric capability for all instruments of national power. All the elements of the dime model, and we can do that without risk to human life. That's a force multiplier in military speak, and it really is something that makes other domains of warfare more effective. Now, while we've been thriving since, ultimately the, Operation Desert Storm, the last 30 plus years, the adversaries have basically had a front door or a front row seat to what we're doing there. And then it makes it, very interesting for them to see the impact it's having for us and actively work to contest those. So China and Russia, some other ones, they've not only developed capabilities, but they've also aligned their service organizations. They've created military doctrine that specifically says they want to use their capabilities to offset the US in space. We've seen them test missiles intended to destroy satellites. In fact, in November, we saw this straight out of Russia, that they actually did destroy a satellite, created 1,500 pieces of really dangerous debris. We've seen them really closely tail satellites on orbit, potential have on orbit impact from that perspective. And then we've also seen them deploy unknown projectiles from satellites, right? So create that real weaponry on space. But unfortunately, when we built these satellites, we didn't do it in a way that would enable them to operate in a domain like that. We thought it was a much more peaceful and benign time for the domain. And so with the long lead time it took to build these satellites, we built entire constellations that were largely defenseless. So it leaves us at a point of a very unacceptable outcome, an enemy that is capable to freely interfere with the space capabilities. So space is very unique from that asymmetric advantage, but it also needs a unique set of people and technology to outpace those threats. Before the Space Force, all those people and processes were housed under the United States Air Force, and they were grown in a different culture. That culture was committed to dominating the air superiority. And the Air Force does that better than any other organization on Earth. But ultimately, it doesn't give you a lot of room to develop and maintain that culture of space that was truly needed to develop the strategists, that was develop the thinkers, that was to develop the operators that could really help make sure that what we design in the future is for that domain. And if what we have now, we can protect. So we need a different type of workforce. It could only be grown over time and in a really, really deliberate manner. And that's what the Space Force is about, building that unique talent and one that's going to change how we operate, how we fight, how we develop, and how we acquire in this domain. And so I urge you to think about that really, Space Force is not necessarily, it is doing a lot right now, but 20 years from now is when you're really going to see the dividends paid for this, when a young crop of officers and enlisted and civilians and contractors that have been around this new culture have allowed that to take hold. This isn't something we're going to change overnight, but it's something that was really important to set the foundation up with the new service. So we recognize the dependence on, as well as the uniqueness of space, and it's become clear that there needed a service to meet those needs. But the clock is really ticking, and it is not driven by us so much as it is as the adversary. Now, sometimes, if we go to the next slide, I think we can be our own worst enemy and adversary here. And I think pop culture has probably done a little bit to raise enthusiasm for space, but probably be a little bit inaccurate in the depiction of what conflict in space looks like. So for those of you that are big Star Wars or Star Trek fans, ultimately space warfare is orchestrated on Earth. It's not rocket ships, it's not the moon, it's not Mars. Most of it is even done away from traditional combat zones. Warfighters have keyboards, not rifles. They speak in orbitology and not artillery. It really requires a different kind of warfighter, ones that truly understand the needs of the other military services. And certainly with you having U.S. Southern Command right there in your backyard, I'm sure the folks here understand that, right, of this joint construct. The folks need to understand other services, the other domains, but they also have to understand the different technologies, doctrine, and operating concepts that are going to be needed to protect what we have up in space right now so that we can enable all those other domains. Adding to a little bit of the confusion that we get from television is the fact that within about 5 months of each other, Space Force and Space Command both stood up. And so a lot of people didn't even know the difference between those two. Let me go to the next one. I'm not a huge fan of charts, but I felt like, this chart and the next are probably the two most important ones in terms of giving you an idea of what space looked like before and after. Right now, we have a very different construct of what we just had in 2019 before this. Let's start on the combatant command side. So, we have 11 combatant commands. We had 10 of them at the time, U.S. Southern Command right there being one of those. But space was housed under the United States Strategic Command in Omaha, Nebraska. Now, the Strategic Command's commander's number one responsibility is nuclear weapons and nuclear command and control. And so even the general at the time, General Hyten, who happened to be a space professional, admitted to Congress that this is just no way to really do the space business because he can't put that focus there because it didn't quite rack up with exactly where nuclear weapons were. So Congress helped us, and they created a combatant command designed specifically for space. On the service side, so the organize, train, and equip, underneath the Chief of Staff of the Air Force was a 4-star general that ran what we call AFSpace, Air Force Space Command. And Air Force Space Command was a major command, one of 11. So space was really on par with 10 other commands within the Air Force. It didn't have exactly the oomph and the push that a lot of folks thought it should. I see we lost the slide, so I'm not going to refer back to them until they come back up. But just keep in mind, right? So we had space was housed under the same warfighting command that did nuclear weapons. And the Space Force service was housed under the same service that really prioritized air superiority. So that's where we had to really move and find a different way of doing business. So in August 2019, we set up a new combatant command. It's led by a 4-star Army general. So not an Air Force space officer, but actually an Army general, General James Dickinson. And now is one of 11 commands. And now he gets to focus solely on that warfighting mission of space. That is headquartered in Colorado Springs, Colorado. That caused plenty of confusion as well, because there was a large battle over that, as well as there was plenty of folks in the media that would confuse Space Force and Space Command headquarters, and it really just didn't help sell the narrative anymore. U.S. Space Force became its own service. If you could see the org chart right now, you would see that now General Raymond, who's a 4-star Chief of Space Operations, is side by side with the Chief of Staff of the Air Force. So we elevated that position up to make it its own service, but underneath the Air Force. Now it's small. It's 16,000 people compared to about 300,000 plus active duty in the Air Force. We're talking 16,000 total military, civilian in the Space Force. So it's very small, but it's really focused on people and systems. And so it has three field commands, one focused on training. So if you're familiar with the Army, this would be like a TRADOC. We have one focused on acquisition, Space Systems Command, and then we have one focused on operations. And so all of those organizations used to exist, but they've been elevated underneath General Raymond and the service to really showcase the additional priority that they need there. I think what else is also important about this is what's not in the service. So I mentioned the NRO earlier. The NRO remains in the intelligence community. It is not a part of the Space Force. You may have heard of the Space Development Agency. That is not a part of the Space Force, though it will be in about 8 months, as soon as the new fiscal year rolls over. So that is going to be, there's just a lot of moving pieces here. It's very easy to get confused with that. And then the Guard and the Reserves. So there is no Space National Guard. There is no Space Force Reserve. So if you were a Air Force space professional and your friends and pals from your career on the active duty side, and you're a guardsman or a reservist, you're staying over in the Air Force until they get that figured out. And that's deliberate. That is certainly out there so that folks can take some time and really figure out how to stand up this organization and how to best utilize it. Because maybe the model is different. Maybe you don't need those 3 separate organizations. Maybe you start to think about how people could go full-time and part-time on active duty and really open up some channels to do some different ways of business. I think one thing that's really interesting too is just how many stakeholders there are in this game. So we talk about the Pentagon, but space goes beyond that, right? And it's so much so because there's a lot of dual use, because we have a vibrant commercial economy, because we have NASA and a civil space mission. So from the top, really, there's a National Space Council. This was brought back by the Trump administration. The Biden administration chose to continue that in place. So now we have an organization within the White House that is elevated and empowered by the vice president to oversee all the space. And just had their first meeting back in December timeframe and has largely continued down the same path that most previous organizations or previous administrations have on the space side. So it really is a bipartisan consensus on what's going on in the space domain. On Congress, so you've got your, on the standard military side, you're going to work with your armed service committees and your defense appropriations committees. But now you've got to consider that you have intelligence committees too that you need to work with. The space traffic management role, which is essentially something that the service is attempting to hand off some of that work. When I talked about space domain awareness, some of that just standard traffic cop kind of job is going to be going over to the Department of Commerce. So now you've got commerce committees in Congress that have their hands in this. So you've got a lot of folks that, that have ways to make decisions and ways to influence this. Speaking of commerce, right? So you have the Department of Commerce. They have an Office of Space Commerce there. Launch is controlled by the FAA. Spectrum is controlled by the FCC. And then we've got NASA, right? So there is a difference between the civil and the national security side, but there's plenty of partnerships that exist there. NASA launches out of Air Force Space Ranges or Space Force Space Ranges, who do the flight safety and the tracking of those launches. They collaborate very broadly. So there's just really a lot of stakeholders here that have a lot more say than just the Space Force when we talk about national security space. What I really want to do is spend a few moments there. So that'll kind of give you a little primer. What is national security space? What's the state of it right now? We've got a combatant command. We've got a service. We've got a lot of interest on Capitol Hill and in the executive branch. So what are the challenges that are out there? What do we see as the landscape? And this is what I'd love to get into with the Q&A. What is out there that really needs to be focused on by our broader national security community? I think we'll start at the top with threats. Threats are out there. We have seen this. And in fact, 11 years ago, a defense space strategy was released, and it was an alliteration: contested, congested, and competitive. So we've been talking about the space domain in those terms for the last 11 years. That is very significant. And we've seen this coming. The Chinese shot down a satellite, and if we just go back to, if we go down to the last slide here, stand by one more after that. There you go. Perfect. So it's really threats, and really this is something we've seen coming. We've been working on, but satellites have a long lead time. They take a long time to build. They're very expensive. So as we start to wrap our head around what a new architecture would look like, how can we do it that can outpace those threats? And it's important to keep in mind threats, right? That what you see right there is roughly a graphical depiction of what happened in November when the Russians shot an ASAT down. But that's not all that's out there. We have co-orbital threats as well. So when I talked about a satellite trailing another one, right? If you get close to something in orbit when you're rotating around the Earth at 17,000 miles an hour, you are going to have a significant amount of damage, right? This is not something that is just going to give you a little bit. You're probably going to be able to take out a satellite just by ramming into it alone, let alone some of the actual weapon capabilities that are being developed to pursue on orbit. But those are expensive, right? Think about creating satellites, think about launching them, or think about even just launching a rocket at a satellite. There's cheaper ways to do this. You can jam. Jamming is not really that hard. You could go to Radio Shack. I guarantee if you Google right now, you can figure out how to build a jammer for GPS. And you can go out. It's just a simple matter of power, and you can actually start to jam satellites. And right, so we're going to see that in conflict. We can see directed energy lasers. Those are pretty expensive, but you can do things from the ground as well without actually having to do anything for launch and have some sort of kinetic impact. The other piece that's really scary here is the cyber side. So think about that, right? Anything you've seen happen on the ground in cyber, you can probably do in space, because the only way we talk to these satellites is through communication links. So, simple as denial of service, right? You shut down the commanding station where a satellite's at. Now the U.S. satellite operators, be they commercial entities or United States military or intelligence capabilities, can't access those satellites, right? You can take it a step further. Potentially, you could even get in the command stream, and you could start to command that satellite. And maybe you want to do something nefarious with it, right? Maybe you just want to prove that you can take over that satellite. But these are very scary, and these are a lot cheaper and a lot of more effective mechanisms because they don't have such outcry from the international community. You see what happened in November with that Russian ASAT launch, anti-satellite missile, right? There's been a lot of unison from the universal community or from the international community on how do we start to grab our hands around creating norms and behaviors. I'm going to talk about that here in just a second, but you don't have to worry about that so much in the cyber realm. And so that's something that's really scary. And we've also seen our adversaries that we're just as worried about on the nuclear warfare and other sort of warfare sides are pretty darn good at cyber too. So it's a threat. It's something that we have to consider, and it's always going to be baked in now moving forward as we start to look at how we develop and implement these platforms. Norms and behaviors. Right now, there's just not a lot of international law that applies to space, and trying to get there will be very, very difficult. I'm not saying it's impossible, but to try and get to some sort of an arms control agreement in space, or to get to some sort of law that would control how people operate within the domain, I think that's a very long way off. So we've got to start to set the example as the US. And we saw this, the Secretary of Defense in July actually put out a note saying that, here were 5 principles of how the US was going to behave in space. We were going to start to set that standard and have the rest of the international community follow along with us. And they're still putting more and more energy and attention to that. But other organizations as well across the globe are starting to think about this. How do we actually protect this domain? We're starting to see more and more satellites go up. And I talked about that from a smaller satellite standpoint, as well as coverage, right? So when we talk about internet from space, what you're seeing SpaceX do with Starlink or other companies, OneWeb, things of that nature, right? There are going to be more satellites up there. So you get to the sustainability side over here on the far right. There's just more things up there. We've got to be cognizant of what's there to make sure that we don't have two objects crashing into one another, whether it's hitting something from a nefarious reason or it's just simply user error. So that's really the challenge we have here, right? Threats have kind of put us into that realm. How do we go out and figure out what the right way to operate is while still maintaining our options as a nation, as the US, but then also to protect the domain? Because ultimately, if we start ending up with a lot more of these accidents, a lot more of these, these actual tests of weaponry, you could have significant portions of orbital domains that are now useless. And then we lose it for everybody. A couple other things I really want to highlight here, and then we'll turn it over for questions. Partnerships, right? We've seen this. Think about the Five Eyes, right? So that has always been something that we have been really committed with from an allied perspective, is working with the Five Eye countries. There's a lot of countries that have capabilities in space that aren't part of that Five Eye. We've seen, Japan, Germany, France have brought incredible capabilities. So how do we bring those in? How do we make sure that the US just isn't doing everything? Because that's what it was trying to do, as it was really the biggest player in space for the last 60 to 70 years. How can we use our partnerships to help deter adversary attacks? How can we use it to help break down a lot of the no foreign visitor, no foreign sharing mechanisms that we have to make sure that everybody understands the domain we're playing in, right? Our alliances are incredibly important. We're seeing that play out in real time today. We've seen the administration put a huge priority on it. And I can guarantee when we see a national defense strategy come out, it's going to say a lot about partnerships and the importance of those. So that picture there, that's the Combined Space Operations Center. That's actually out in California. And we actually do work with those international partners hand in hand there. And that's something that we're going to continue to leverage. When you see General Raymond, you see him talk about this a lot. And that is something that really, both on the intelligence community side, because you've seen the National Reconnaissance Office do this as well, but the Space Force side as well. And that's something we've got to do is you have to leverage those partnerships and capabilities. We cannot buy it all. We cannot protect it all. And we have to work together. Pentagon Wars, I don't know if you've ever seen this movie. If not, it'd make a great weekend watch when you've got some lousy weather and can't enjoy the Miami sunshine. But, really, I think I like to highlight this because I talked about the Space Force being 16,000 people. You don't have as many generals. You don't have as big of staffs. So when you are in the Pentagon, you're getting in those knife fights over capabilities, when you're having those discussions about what the services can provide the warfighter and what the DoD wants to authorize and fund, it can be difficult if you don't have the star power to match. So how can space sing the praises of what it's doing without necessarily these massive bureaucratic organizations? Because as Congress stood up Space Force, it specifically mandated you have to stay very small. Space is very shiny right now. It's getting a lot of attention right now, and that's great. And it's getting increased budgets. We just saw the budget come out the other day and had about a $500 million plus up on the Space Force account. But is it going to stay that way, right? Are they going to continue to win those arguments, and are they continue to help integrate into the services? And the final pit is on integration. Commercial satellites are already producing incredible results. I've showed you that intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance imagery there. There's communication capability. There's so much that the commercial market is bringing. It can do it quickly, and it can do it very cheaply. That said, there are mission assurance pieces of this too, where we have to make sure some of these no-fail missions like nuclear command and control are actually, executed in the manner that they need to be. So finding that blend, and as we develop the new architectures that are going to protect us right back to that first challenge, the threats, how are we going to do this with a mix of the traditional built satellites for the service, but then also with the commercial birds? So with that, I think we're right around the time to get in 20 minutes of Q&A. Thank you for bearing with me with the slide issue there, but hopefully I kind of set the landscape up teed up some questions you might have, and let me turn it over to Paul to moderate the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you very much, John. Personally, I feel like that was a really very insightful and informative lecture. You really distilled a lot of information down into a really digestible format. So really appreciate it. And I'm sure the rest of our audience feels the same. And thank you for adapting while we had the loss of slides in the middle there for a little bit. I think the weather was impacting us a little bit down here. But yes, yeah, I think we're excited to hear from our audience. Please don't be shy with sharing any comments, thoughts, questions that you have in response to John's presentation. I'd be happy to get things started with a question that popped up for me kind of midway through your PowerPoint, and then something that you really kind of emphasized at the end with the challenges. But from a space perspective, what is the role of the private sector moving forward? You know, you mentioned, of course, naturally kind of take a Florida angle on this. You mentioned that there's a lot of activity along the coast of Florida between Blue Origin and SpaceX doing launches regularly. And then, of course, we also have a lot of booming tech industry from cybersecurity to web development and that kind of thing. So I'm curious to see, to get your thoughts on what kind of role the private sector can play in integrating in these programs moving forward.
Yeah, great question. And I mean, I think it's kind of limitless right now. You know, I think that, again, there's always going to be a need for military and intelligence capabilities that have to be fairly bespoke and that, you know, have to have certain mission assurance bits to it. But, you know, just broader private sector commercial industry's got a ton of opportunity right now. The launch business is a great example, and you can kind of see it there in the backyard. You know, I think that there's, you know, in the launch sector too, right? Keep in mind, there's commercial space tourism. We're going to see a Blue Origin New Shepard flight go up here again very soon. We're seeing SpaceX launch astronauts to the International Space Station, right? And I think as you start to build up that economy, it all helps build on one another. And that's certainly from a financial perspective, but also from a workforce. There is no shortage of need for STEM educated. And I do not have a STEM education either. I've got a journalism degree and an MBA, but just for space talent out there. So it's certainly somewhere where we need our best and brightest going to help communicate that need and to help really drive a lot of that private industry innovation over to the military. You know, if I'm looking at this from a national security perspective, we need to think about things differently. How can we offload missions like we were going to do with this space situational awareness and make sure that the military is focusing on what they're doing, but still enable pathways for business innovation on the private sector side. And then really, you know, I think if we come back to the DoD and the IC, right now, there's some concerns of trying to work with them, right? If you're a small private company trying to bridge the valley of death, if you will, of getting a program of record after you've, you know, successfully demonstrated some great technologies, being able to, you know, kind of carry that through. There's a lot of organizations right now, a ton of them focused on how do we do that on the space side. And, you know, certainly I think folks should look at a DIU, Defense Innovation Unit. So they're doing a lot on space. There's something called SpaceWorks. There's, you know, these kind of areas where you can see that more up and coming commercial sector of space have opportunities to plug in. And I would say certainly keep pushing. That is it, right? I mean, I think there is so much happening right now, and it really is showing right now. Every day you turn on the TV and you see that imagery, or you see a company talk about how they're detecting GPS interference, something like that. Those are all commercial satellite capabilities. And those are all things that the government can go out and buy your service and not necessarily just buy your hardware. That makes it faster, that makes it cheaper. It's also difficult because the government hasn't really been all that effective at doing that in the past. And that's something that they have to work, but keep pushing those products out, keep pushing the envelope. We're not really at a point anymore where the government is going to lead the way in technology. It's got to follow the private industry's lead, but it has to invest to help keep that tempo up so that we can actually see a lot of those technologies come to bear.
Yeah, that's a great point, and again, great insight for our audience to consider. I think you touched on something that leads into a follow-up question that I had, and something I'm sure Dean Hoffman and the college is curious about as well. But I think with a number of students in the audience today, I'm sure they're wondering, what can they do? How can they start planning or preparing themselves for the jobs of the future in this sector, whether it's with working for the government, the intelligence services, the DoD, or the private sector? What would you recommend to students to start keeping in mind as they're choosing their classes and their career paths?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I do think that a lot of this is going to go on the bleeding edge of tech. And so STEM educations are going to be really, really important. I think you always still need a storyteller, and that's probably why I get to still keep a job, but really on that tech edge. But I think you can always find a tie back to space. It is growing. Find yourself, plug into a conference, plug into your local communities of what they're doing there. Maybe you've got some universities that have contracts with the Space Force so that their labs are doing things, right? That's something that the service is really trying to start investing in, is utilizing what we have in academia already, right? We don't have time, and we certainly don't have money to waste when there's already capability out there. So to try and plug in from that perspective. One thing, and I'll get on a little bit of a soapbox here, because I truly do believe Space Force is a people problem. That's what it was set to solve. Yes, it could certainly be argued that the Air Force prioritized buying airplanes over satellites. Yes, it could be argued that the acquisition system for space has issues, that this service will help that. But ultimately, this is about those people that are sitting in dorm rooms right now that may have never considered working in the service before. As I talked about, most of space is done domestically in climate-conditioned operations centers in Colorado or California. By the way, if you join, you've got some pretty good assignments there. But this should, and you're starting to see this. The Space Force has something called the Guardian Ideal, and it is their new human capital management strategy. And they're a new service. They can go and do things weird. And when and I mean weird is in terms of what the services are already doing, that is very old and archaic. You don't need to be able to grab a rifle and run a certain distance in a certain amount of time to be in the Space Force. And they're starting to look at that. General Raymond had a comment about how they brought in a diabetic graduate from the United States Air Force Academy, and their medical condition would have precluded them from service. So I think what's really important about the Space Force is we are opening the door to more people to serve. And if you want to come in the service, that's wonderful. It is only 29% of the American population right now are eligible to serve in the military. They can blow that out of the water because of the constraints that their career field won't necessarily put on their members. But there's civilian opportunities there as well. And then I think they're going to start to open up, when we talked about the reserve side, this part-time and a full-time piece, right? So that maybe you don't have to go do it full-time. You can start to work at a company, or you can work in academia, or you can work at a think tank, and you could take your weekends. Full disclosure, I'm a reservist. You can take your weekends and go put on the uniform and serve, and have that opportunity there. So really, I think the Space Force is really going to be help leading a lot of this. But then just this giant economy that's blowing up. There's going to be internships. I've seen so many great fellowship programs open up in the last 2 or 3 years that are looking out there to develop the next generation. And then the other part that's fun about it is the seniors in this industry care. I've not seen so many people at such a high success level personally get interested in shaping the future workforce, right? And so you can go out and look at a few of these things. There's a Space Generation Fusion Forum. There's SGX at a conference called Satellite next week. But a lot of real heavy hitters in our community that want to give back, that understand that the path that they help blaze, they need to fill it with the talent behind them. And so it's just I think it's a really great time. And my email is at the end of those slides. You are more than welcome to share it with any of your viewers. But when you just get so passionate about the career field, you want to make sure that we've got the best and brightest coming in. I think it's a great time to be coming.
That's great. That's really cool. It sounds like there's a lot of maybe new career paths that are opening up for people to pursue in this field. So that's great. I want to turn it over to my colleague from the World Affairs Council of Miami, Linnea Robbins, to ask a question. Linnea? There, I think you're on mute still.
Sorry. Thank you, Paul. And thank you so much, John, for this great presentation. I was wondering, following Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the conversation focusing on shifting energy sources away from Russia as a means for the US to acquire energy, as well as other problematic sources, might space be an option for energy, such as space-based solar energy, for example?
Yeah, I think it's got some great investment potential. It's a little ways off though. And I think that is something that we should not let our eye off the ball of. I think where space could probably help in the more near term is verification, right? Is to starting to keep an eye on Russia, on where are they selling energy to potentially, right? I mean, you can keep an eye on fuel ports and things like that. But space can also, I think right now, probably the biggest thing it's going to be providing, and you're seeing the focus out of the administration on this, is there is so much effort that space can do towards climate change, right? Weather monitoring, testing new technologies, monitoring methane and emissions, things of that nature, right? So I think that the science that space can contribute right now back to Earth, back to America, and then partner with the incredible technologies we have here to try and find new ways to, really better our energy, reduce our footprint. I think that's probably where it's going to be most in line to actually help us on an energy perspective. But I do think there's some real value in keeping an eye of monitoring what's going on. It's a lot more difficult to hide anything anymore. And as we're finding out, certainly the use of that, the very strategic communications that we can have based off of the findings that we're seeing from space can certainly help to shape the international narrative and really help, rally coalitions as they're maybe starting to make decisions on, do we want to rely on this fuel? Well, what else are they doing, right? And I mean, you can even see this with other nations, that maybe they're committing human rights violations. And we've seen that. Maybe that's gonna, you start to expose that a little bit more from space, and maybe the actual perspective of the community starts to shift of, maybe I don't want to go do business with this country, or maybe I need to pare back a little bit. So I think those are going to be the more near-term things. But to the broader point of your question, yeah, there's a lot out there, right? I mean, I think there's a lot of business that can be had if you start to look at solar from space, if you start to look at asteroid mining, things like that. It's just we're a bit off from that. It's going to take continuing to keep the field burgeoning with top talent and top dollars to really help get us to those kind of places.
Thank you.
Great. I've another question, John. It's kind of somewhat similar to what Linnea is asking, but it seems like from your presentation that that the U.S. is a real leader in this area, especially from a public sector or government-oriented perspective. But I'm wondering, where does our progress compare to that of other countries that might be investing in this? And you mentioned that recently that Russia shot down a satellite, so it seems like they're at least developing some capabilities. Or is the U.S. the clear front runner in this area? Is there a lot of competition? Are we working well with our allies to help build their capabilities? How do you see that side of it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think the answer is any good foreign policy answer would be is it depends. Solely from a military perspective, from a national security space perspective, there's nobody that can compare to what the United States has. Now, that said, China and Russia are certainly nipping at the heels and starting to, have the real capabilities that can offset our advantages there. In the broader international space community, though, we've got over 100 nations that have assets on orbit. So you see a lot of investment out there. And while they may not have as much exquisite things that we have, they might be doing something really well. I don't have the graphic on me, so I would hate to quote the numbers, but the intelligence community put out something. They did a commercial remote sensing Olympics. And so remote sensing, think weather, think imagery, synthetic aperture radar, those kind of things. And they looked at different characteristics. Who takes the best panchromatic, which is essentially a black and white image? Who has the best radar? And they essentially awarded medals to the nations and who had the best, both within their government and also within their, just their organic industrial base. And the U.S. doesn't win every one of them. And so, but that's also, we may not need to, right? I mean, depending on who has those capabilities, that's something that's important as we, look out. And something I didn't get to chat a lot about is State Department has quite a role here in the space sector, and they're growing that operation quite a bit. They've been pretty busy since November, as you can probably guess. But thinking about that from arms control perspectives, thinking about commerce from import and export perspectives, it's important to keep our eye on what's out there. I'll also touch on the civil space perspective too, because these partnerships are so important. NASA launched something called the Artemis Accords a couple of years ago, and I think that the 17th nation just signed on to that. So cooperation in the civil space realm has probably been one of the greatest soft power tools our country has. Like there is a Russian cosmonaut on the International Space Station right now with US astronauts. Right, we are partnered up there. Now there are some tensions and there's some friction, and we've certainly seen some interesting conversation come out of the Russian space leads. But at the same time, we collaborate there together, and starting to build out what we see for the future of NASA and for the future of civil space, and getting more and more countries that you don't have to have your own organic capability to launch an astronaut. You can contribute a part or a piece to a space station, or you can contribute something to a mission, or you can develop astronauts. Those things all together have an incredible role that I don't think we can truly quantify in terms of, I can take this picture this well, or I can push this much bandwidth down from a satellite. And I think that's really important. And the U.S. has to maintain leadership in that domain. And this Artemis Accords has been a fantastic way that they've done that. Something to just also keep in mind from a perspective that might not fit into the whole military and intelligence capability.
Great, thank you.
We have two interesting questions. One is regarding the Space Force and protecting satellites from hackers. And then the second question would be regarding UAP disclosures. Might we see any more of those, or what would that look like for the future in terms of those disclosures?
Yeah, unfortunately, I've not been out to see the aliens, and I've never, I don't have much on background on that one. I think that's something that I certainly watch with interest, just because it's captivating. But I just can't really answer that. I know the department is running the lead on that, and probably whatever you see disclosed is the same that I'm going to get to see too. But back to the point on cyber though, that is a real concern. So what we saw in the last administration, they had what were called space policy directives. And the fifth one that they put out was about cybersecurity. And it was, how do we make sure that we're protecting these assets? The Department of Homeland Security, within their critical infrastructure group, CISA, actually has a working group there that I get to fortunately co-chair with the government over there. I do the industry side to start to look at that exact problem set. How do we do this better, right? How do we make sure that we are protecting the cyber capabilities, or potentially, we're not even just necessarily talking about the satellites. Think about receivers, think about your GPS receivers in your cars or your phones or things like that, right? How do we make sure that the broader industry knows this, and this is something we can do? It's difficult. And by the time you would try to codify any sort of prescriptive measures to fix it, it'd likely be out of date because of just how quick the cyber threat's changing. So it's something that we really have to compel folks to do, and it's difficult. That is something that costs a lot of money to bake in up front. And if you're trying to close a commercial case in space, when you have such an expensive cost to get on orbit, and just such a lot of money you have to put up front, that may be something that you want to consider skimping out on. And that is something that the government has to think about when they're going to look at purchasing from someone, is how they manage their cyber risk, because that's the last thing you need, is if you start relying on a capability and then you come to find out, oh boy, we've got some sort of a hack, and now this thing is completely vulnerable and we've got a lot of dependencies on it. So it's something that I think, and also, right, that's somewhere there that we're doing this group. I mean, I'm from the space business. I work a lot with the satellite providers, the launchers, the hardware folks. We need more in cyber. We've got a lot of great people and a lot of great companies doing that, but we need more. And so I think that is somewhere we'll never be able to overinvest in when we think about how we want to protect these capabilities.
Great, thank you so much, John. I'm gonna just share my screen quickly with the slide that you gave us that has your email address on it, so our audience can see that just for a moment. But really want to thank you again for your time and for this really insightful and comprehensive conversation about this really relevant and important topic. Would like to thank again the Miami-Dade College Honors College and Dean Eric Hoffman. They've been a great supporter of these kind of conversations that have been so impactful for our academic and international communities. Would like to thank everybody for joining us today. For those of you who submitted some questions for John, thank you for your time and for chatting with us this afternoon. And finally, if you're interested in learning more about the World Affairs Council of Miami, and if you would like to attend other events that are similar to today's lecture, I encourage you to visit our website at www.worldaffairs.miami. Thank you all again, and have a great evening.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, John.